My name is Elena Marsh, and I was standing in a hospital records room at 11 at night, staring at my mother's signature on a document she could not possibly have signed. She had been unconscious for 19 days. I worked at Ridgeview Memorial as a compliance auditor, the person who reads the fine print nobody else wants to read, the person who checks whether a signature matches a timestamp matches a witness log. It was quiet work. It was supposed to be boring. And yet there I was, holding a power of attorney form dated 6 days into my mother's coma, her name written in ink at the bottom in handwriting that was almost hers, but not quite. The date on the form told me she had been awake. The hospital's own vitals chart told me she had not. Someone in this building had decided those two facts didn't need to agree with each other. I did not call anyone that night. I did not confront anyone. I photographed the page, slid it back into the folder exactly where I found it, and walked out to my car with my hands shaking so hard I dropped my keys twice in the parking lot. Because here is what I already knew, standing there in the dark. My sister's husband, Marcus, had been managing my mother's finances for 2 years. My sister, Vanessa, trusted him completely. And somewhere between my mother's stroke and that signature on the page, somebody had decided that a woman who couldn't lift a spoon to her own mouth had been well enough to sign away control of everything she owned. I didn't know yet how deep it went. I didn't know who else at that hospital had helped make it happen, or why a man I'd once shared Thanksgiving dinner with would do something like this to a woman who used to sing to him in the kitchen. I didn't know if my sister was part of it, or if she was about to become its next victim. What I did know is this. I was the only person in that building who had both the access to find the truth and the reason to look for it. And once I saw that signature, there was no version of my life where I pretended I hadn't. 3 weeks earlier, my mother, Diane Marsh, collapsed in her kitchen while making tea. A neighbor found her an hour later, unresponsive on the tile floor, the kettle still screaming on the stove. By the time the ambulance reached Ridgeview Memorial, the stroke had taken most of the movement on her left side and enough of her consciousness that the doctors used the word critical without softening it. I got the call at work. I remember standing up so fast my chair rolled into the wall behind me, and I remember nothing else about the drive to the hospital except that I ran 2 red lights and didn't care. Vanessa was already there when I arrived, sitting outside the ICU with her husband Marcus's arm around her shoulders. Vanessa had always been the soft one, the one who cried at commercials, the one who called our mother every single Sunday without fail. Marcus was the steady one, or so we'd always believed, an insurance adjuster with a calm voice and a habit of taking charge in a crisis, the kind of man who brought printed checklists to family emergencies. She's stable, he told me before I even reached the door, like he'd already appointed himself the family spokesperson. I've already called her attorney. We should think about getting her affairs in order, just in case. Just in case. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say about a woman who hadn't even been diagnosed yet. For the first week, I barely left the hospital. I worked remotely from a chair beside her bed, reviewing compliance files on my laptop while machines breathed for the woman who used to sing off-key while she cooked. Marcus visited every other day, always for exactly 40 minutes, always alone. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief makes people strange in 100 small ways, and I told myself his silence, his punctuality, his need to be useful, were simply his. It was on day 11 that I noticed the first thing that didn't fit. I was reviewing my mother's insurance file for billing purposes, a routine part of my job, since Ridgeview required family members who worked internally to formally recuse themselves from any account touching a relative, which meant I had to file the recusal paperwork myself, which meant I had to look at the account first. And there, in the digital record, was a scanned advance directive dated 3 days after her stroke. It listed Marcus as sole medical decision-maker. It listed a new, primary emergency contact. It was not me. It was not Vanessa. It was a name I didn't recognize, Harold Denny. I didn't say anything to anyone that day. I told myself there was probably an explanation, that maybe my mother had an old friend named Harold, that maybe this was nothing. I've built my entire career on the belief that a single strange document rarely means what it appears to mean until you've checked 3 more things around it. So I checked. The first thing I checked was the notary stamp. It listed a notary named Patricia Ruiz, employed at a currency exchange 20 minutes from the hospital. I called her office the next morning, pretending to confirm a routine notarization for insurance purposes. Patricia Ruiz had been on medical leave for 6 weeks. She had notarized nothing in that window. The second thing I checked was the visitor log for the day the document was allegedly signed. My mother had been listed as unresponsive on every vitals chart that day. The only visitor logged for her room was Marcus. The third thing I checked, the thing that made my stomach turn to ice, was the man named Harold Denny. A basic public records search took me 4 minutes. Harold Denny was a licensed financial advisor. He worked at the same firm where Marcus had, 6 months earlier, quietly moved my mother's retirement account for better returns, a decision she had apparently approved by phone, according to the paperwork on file. My mother did not use a smartphone with any reliability. She still wrote checks. She had never once mentioned a man named Harold to me or to Vanessa in her life. That was the day I stopped believing this was carelessness and started believing it was a plan. I went home that night and did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind I used at work when a hospital account didn't add up, and I wrote down every date, every signature, every dollar I could find moving out of my mother's accounts over the past 2 years. Small amounts at first. A transfer here, a loan there, always described as temporary, always undocumented by any actual loan agreement. Then larger ones, beginning almost exactly when Marcus took over managing her finances after our father passed. By the time the sun came up, I had a single number circled at the bottom of the page, $211,000. Money that had once been my mother's retirement, her safety net, the fund she'd built over 30 years working as a school librarian, one modest paycheck at a time. I called Vanessa that morning and asked her, as gently as I knew how, if she'd ever heard of a man named Harold Denny. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she said, quietly, "Why are you asking me that?" And in that pause, in the way her voice cracked on the word why, I understood 2 things at once. My sister did not know what her husband had done. And whatever I told her next was going to break something in her life that could never be put back together the same way again. I met Vanessa at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place with sticky menus and a waitress who calls everyone Han, because I needed somewhere that wasn't home, wasn't the hospital, wasn't anywhere Marcus might walk in and see us together with our heads bent over documents. I laid it out for her slowly. The advance directive with the fraudulent notary stamp. The visitor log that placed Marcus alone in our mother's room on a day she was medically documented as unresponsive. The transfers. Harold Denny's employment record. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask her to hate her husband. I simply put the pieces on the table between the ketchup bottle and her untouched coffee and let her see the shape they made. She read through it twice. Her hands were steady the first time. They were not steady the second. "He told me the market was rough," she whispered. "He told me Mom wanted to consolidate everything so it would be easier to manage. He showed me a signed authorization. I saw her signature, Elena. I saw it." "So did I said. "That's the problem." What Vanessa didn't know, what I only found out over the following days, once she agreed, shaking, to let me see the home files Marcus kept in a locked cabinet in his study, files she still had a key to because it was, after all, her house too, was that the fraud went back further than either of us imagined. Marcus had been quietly restructuring our mother's finances since before our father's death, positioning himself, through Harold Denny's firm, as the primary beneficiary on 2 annuities our mother had never intended for anyone but her daughters. He had also, we discovered, opened a joint account in our mother's name and his own 8 months earlier, an account she had never once mentioned, into which her monthly pension now automatically deposited. The most damning discovery came from something Vanessa remembered almost as an afterthought. Marcus had asked her, 3 weeks before the stroke, almost casually over dinner, what she thought about getting their mother-in-law's affairs properly organized, just to be safe. At the time it had sounded like love. Looking back, it sounded like a rehearsal. I brought everything to a forensic document examiner named Renata Cole, a woman I'd worked with twice before on hospital fraud cases, someone whose testimony had held up in 3 separate elder abuse prosecutions. She confirmed within 2 days what I already suspected. The signature on the advance directive did not match my mother's known signature in 17 distinct measurable ways, from letter slant to pen pressure to the specific way my mother always looped the lower half of her E's, a habit from decades of grading student essays in cursive. I also, carefully, quietly, requested the hospital's internal security footage for the day the document was allegedly notarized. This was the part of the plan that terrified me most, because it meant going through Dr. Reyes, the hospital's chief administrator, a man I had worked under for 4 years and trusted, mostly, the way you trust anyone whose name is on your paycheck. What I found in that footage answered a question I hadn't even known to ask yet. The footage showed Marcus entering my mother's room alone at 2:14 p.m. It showed him leaving 11 minutes later. It also showed, walking past the nurse's station 40 minutes earlier, a woman in a gray blazer I did not recognize, carrying a folder, who signed the visitor log under a name that did not match Patricia Ruiz, the supposedly medically absent notary. When I pulled the visitor log entry itself, the signature there had been altered, a name half erased and rewritten by hand. I brought this to Dr. Reyes not as Elena the daughter, but as Elena the compliance auditor, because I understood something about power that Marcus apparently didn't. The fastest way to stop a lie is to make the person hiding it believe you already have all the proof and are simply giving them one chance to explain themselves before you use it. Dr. Reyes went pale within 30 seconds of seeing the footage. It turned out the gray blazer belonged to a woman named Sherry Talbot, a mobile notary who did occasional off-book work for Marcus's firm, arranged, we would later learn, through a financial referral relationship between Harold Denny and someone on Ridgeview's own billing staff. A relationship that had, over the years, quietly funneled a small number of vulnerable, unconscious, or newly widowed patients toward estate consultations that were never disclosed to the hospital's ethics board. I was not the first person this had happened to. I was simply the first person who worked inside the building and knew exactly where to look. That night, sitting outside my mother's room while a nurse checked her vitals, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Heard you've been asking questions at the hospital. We should talk before this gets messy for everyone, including you. I read it twice. Then I looked through the glass at my mother, at the tube taped gently along her cheek, at the slow rhythmic rise of her chest that was the only proof she was still fighting for a life someone had already tried to steal from her while she couldn't defend it. I typed back 4 words, and for the first time since I'd found that signature, I felt something other than fear. It's already too late. I did not go to Marcus. I went to a lawyer. Her name was Grace Okafor, an elder law attorney Renata had worked with before, a woman with a reputation for moving quietly until the exact moment it mattered, and then moving very fast. I brought her every document, every timestamp, every discrepancy, laid out with the same discipline I used for hospital audits, because that was the only language I trusted myself to think clearly in anymore. Grace listened without interrupting for almost 40 minutes. When I finished, she said one sentence that I have not forgotten since. You've already built the case. We're just going to make it official. Within a week, Grace filed for an emergency guardianship hearing, along with a formal request to freeze the joint account Marcus had opened in our mother's name. She also filed a report with the state's Adult Protective Services Division, attaching Renata's forensic signature analysis and the altered visitor log as supporting evidence. Because I still worked at Ridgeview, I filed my own internal ethics complaint the same afternoon, naming both the notary irregularity and the undisclosed referral relationship between Harold Denny's firm and hospital billing staff, a complaint that triggered an automatic compliance review Dr. Reyes could not quietly bury, even if he'd wanted to. Vanessa did something I had not expected, and something I will never stop respecting her for. She went home that same night, packed a bag while Marcus was at work, and moved into my apartment. She left him a single note that said only, "I know what you did to my mother.
Talk to my lawyer."
The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 3.5 weeks after I first found that signature in the records room. Marcus arrived with his own attorney, composed, in a gray suit not unlike the notary's blazer, ready, I think, to argue that this was a misunderstanding between grieving family members. He had clearly prepared for tears. He had not prepared for evidence. Grace laid it out with the same calm precision I had used at that diner with Vanessa weeks earlier. The forged notary stamp. Renata's signature analysis, presented in careful, measurable detail. The altered visitor log. The joint account opened without disclosure. The undisclosed referral relationship that Ridgeview's own compliance office had, by then, confirmed and suspended pending state investigation. The judge, a woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, asked exactly 2 questions of Marcus's attorney, both of which went unanswered in any way that resembled an explanation. Marcus did not raise his voice. I remember that clearly because I think some part of me had braced for him to. Instead, he simply sat very still, his jaw tight, while the life he had quietly built for himself over 2 years came apart in a courtroom that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. The judge granted emergency guardianship to Vanessa and me jointly. She ordered the joint account frozen, pending a full financial audit. She referred the forged advance directive to the district attorney's office for criminal review. 2 months later, Marcus was formally charged with elder financial exploitation and forgery of a legal document, charges that, combined with a parallel state investigation into Harold Denny's firm, eventually led to a plea agreement requiring full restitution and permanent revocation of his financial licensing. I would love to tell you my mother woke up in time to see any of it. She didn't, not fully, not for a long time. But 6 weeks after that hearing, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while Vanessa was reading her magazine article about a recipe she used to make every Christmas, my mother's eyes opened, tracked slowly around the room, and settled on her daughter sitting on either side of her bed. Her mouth moved before her voice caught up to it. The first word she managed, hoarse and small and entirely her own, was Vanessa's name. The second, a few seconds later, was mine. Recovery, real recovery, took months. She had to relearn how to hold a spoon, how to form full sentences, how to walk the length of a hallway without someone's arm beneath hers. But she came back to us, slowly, stubbornly, in the same quiet, determined way she had raised us, and the first time she was strong enough to sit upright and hear the whole story, from the signature in the records room to the hearing in that courtroom, she reached out with her weaker hand, found mine and held on. "You didn't yell," she said when I finished. Her voice was still thin, still recovering its old rhythm. "You didn't fight him. You just found the truth." "That's all I ever needed," I told her. "The truth doesn't need me to shout for it. It just needs someone to actually look." I still work at Ridgeview. I still sit in the same records room some nights, reviewing files under fluorescent lights that hum too loudly in the silence. But I don't walk through that room the same way anymore. I know now that behind every routine signature, every quiet date on a form, there can be an entire life someone is fighting to protect, or an entire life someone is quietly trying to take. My mother is home now. She makes tea again, slowly, carefully, one hand steadying the other, and every time I hear that kettle start to whistle, I think of the night I stood alone in that records room, terrified and certain all at once, and I remember that the loudest kind of justice is very often the quietest kind of patience. That whistle, these days, sounds like nothing in the world so much as peace.